Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start as we started at the beginning by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting here in Toowoomba, the Guyabal and Yarraway people, and pay our respects to their continuing relationship and custodianship of the land and their elders past, present and emerging. I'm quite excited to be here today. I'm a doctor, and so I don't often get to talk at multi-faith events, but I am also a man of faith. And it gladdens my heart to see people of so many different traditions here with us today, sharing our humanity together and sharing an interest in forging good relationships. I'm sure we'll have some slides shortly. But I was asked to talk about ethics. And of course, ethics is very important. Thank you. Ethics is not often something that we talk about in clinical medicine. It's normally something that's decided and we have guidelines and policies and procedures to follow. But of course, that's being grossly simplistic. At the end of the day, when you have a patient in front of you, all clinicians, doctors, nurses, everyone involved in care have to make decisions about the allocation of resources. Working in public health, I have the privilege of having a broader systems view. Not as broad as say, Bishop Cameron or Mr McDougall and their roles are in large areas of the state, but nevertheless, during this pandemic we've been blessed really to have developed vaccines to fight this virus which is ravaging the world. But developing those vaccines has come at a cost that we don't often think about here in the privileged situation, the privileged community that we're in here in Toowoomba and on the Darling Downs. So I thought we would take a journey through some of those issues today. If we can get the slides working. There we go. The plan. So the plan for our journey through vaccines and resources today are to look at where we are and how we got here and where we're going still, both across the world and here in Australia. So where are we? So the Johns Hopkins University has a running tracker of cases of COVID-19. And I'd like to reiterate the point that Bishop Cameron made before, that statistics can sometimes hide humanity. So there have been 259, 465 and 36 cases of COVID-19. There have been at least, and I think this is a gross oversimplification, but at least 5 million deaths from COVID-19. Now that's 5 million out of a global population of 7 billion or so. But that's 5 billion people just like you and just like me. And I like my life and I love my loved ones. And the thought of them passing away brings a tear to my eye. And yet, that's the lived reality for 5 million people from this virus that no one had heard about 2 years ago. The world has changed. But there is also hope. In green there have been almost 7.5 billion doses of vaccine given. Vaccines that we didn't know about 2 years ago. So we've moved quickly. And there is hope. These figures were updated yesterday, but they're an estimation. We heard earlier of hundreds of thousands of cases across the world, and that the enormous numbers in the United States and in India and in Brazil. Here in Queensland, we're pretty happy with that we know when there's a case because we test. But testing in rural India, in Brazil is not quite the same as what we expect here, and the tremendous service we have through a drive-through setup at the Bailey Henderson campus. So for sure we're going to be underestimating cases. We're going to be underestimating deaths. This is just a guide, and it's frightening enough as it is. So let's talk about vaccines. The top row is our standard approach. The traditional process to developing vaccines takes about 10 or 15 years. Years, not months, years. And we start with preclinical trials where we might administer the vaccine in a cell culture and then to a relatively simple creature and then progress to a lab rat. Those lab rats that we refer to in popular culture do exist. And then for some brave souls, we give this vaccine to humans. We do phase 1 trials, safety trials. We move to phase 2, where we're again looking at safety, but at immunogenicity. So does the immune system work when presented with this vaccine? Does it produce antibodies and protect the person from the pathogen that we are trying to vaccinate them against? And then we move to phase 3 trials, still looking at safety and at efficacy. So does it actually work? Not only does the immune system develop antibodies, do those antibodies stop the person from getting sick? And once we have enough data, it gets approved. Big green tick. It's then produced, and then it's spread out in the world, and there's ongoing surveillance and ongoing marketing, post-marketing surveillance to make sure that it's safe. And we've managed to do that in 12 to 18 months. And that scares people who think that these vaccines aren't safe, and I understand that, I really do. So let's try and allay some of those fears. We know some 15, 20 years ago, there was SARS, back when there was only one SARS and not SARS-CoV-2. But SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which caused quite a significant public health crisis in Asia in particular. Now, this new coronavirus, what was the novel coronavirus that we now call SARS-CoV-2, is very related. And fortunately, there was a group at Oxford University that was producing a vaccine against SARS. So we already had 10 years of research into that. And it just got to the stage where we could pull out the bit that was specific for the original SARS and put in SARS-CoV-2, and bang, we're 10 years of research down the track. So that's pretty good, I reckon. But more than that, we've had cooperation. And that's something that we don't often have in international affairs. And it's very nice to see. But we've had a lot of governments and a lot of companies working together, sharing technology, pooling funding, reducing red tape. And so we could do things at the same time. So we had some of the preclinical studies that were already done, but we were able to run phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials simultaneously. We were able to be producing vaccine in the hope that the phase 3 trials would lead to approval. Now that was a calculated risk. We know that here in Queensland, the University of Queensland was developing a vaccine against COVID, and that ran into problems. We know that that vaccine was already being produced when it was stopped. So we know that that too is one of many vaccines which did not quite make it to the final hurdle. But such was the will to develop this vaccine that governments were happy to fund production, even with the knowledge that it may not go ahead. And I think that was pretty big of them. And of course, it's a shame that the homegrown vaccine didn't make the final cut, but that's okay. We still learnt from that process. But even more thankfully, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna, Novavax, they did make the final cut through this process. I want to talk a bit more about this process. We gloss over it. We talk about, there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. Oh, that's good. They must be safe. But who decides who's participating in those trials? Because those trials involve injecting a substance which we don't know an awful lot about, by definition, into people that have rolled up their sleeves. In Australia, in common medical practice, we talk about informed consent. What is informed consent? I'm sure if I asked you all to write down what informed consent was, you'd all give me different answers. I'm sure I'd write down half a dozen different answers myself. And what we might think of informed consent here in Toowoomba, here in Australia, is probably going to be different to the lived reality of people living in other parts of the world. If you are offered a trial vaccine and you are living in a place that has poor healthcare, that is being ravaged by this unknown virus, which is killing people around you, who among us wouldn't roll up their sleeve? I think I would. But that person then is selflessly exposing themselves to risk, a risk that we haven't faced here in Toowoomba, because no trials to my knowledge have included people in Toowoomba in them. And yet we've benefited from that. These trials, not just for these vaccines, these COVID vaccines, but for almost every medication that we use, are conducted every day around the world. Now, fortunately, they're involved they're run in many countries around the world, including Australia. And because there are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, there are differing degrees of risk. Now, the idealist in me would hope that the phase 1 trials, the first time that this substance has been knowingly administered to a human, that those trials are performed in well-resourced countries where there are experienced scientists, clinicians on hand to be able to counter any ill effect that may occur. That those trials are occurring in well-informed participants who are aware of the risks and benefits, and that they are being well remunerated for the risks that they're taking. That's what the idealist in me wants to believe. The realist in me suspects that that's not always the case. So the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, so that's the college, the specialist college that many of your GPs would belong to, and that I belong to as a fellow, they have an information sheet on informed consent. And so in contemporary Australia, informed consent is the process whereby a patient makes a voluntary decision about their medical care with knowledge and understanding of the benefits and potential risks involved. There's an awful lot in that one sentence. A patient making a voluntary decision. Well, we've heard from the Commissioner about concerns that people have about vaccine mandates and making voluntary decisions. But even before we get to our current scenario, being involved in research when this virus is running around the world, it's a scary place in November 2021. The world was even scarier, I think, in March and April 2020, when we knew an awful lot less about this virus. And yet just a couple of months on from that was when we were starting to trial the first vaccines. So who amongst us can say that any decision to be involved would be voluntary? Knowledge and understanding of the benefits and potential risks. Well, knowledge of benefits, it might stop you from dying. That's a pretty good benefit. But the potential risks are tremendously unknown for phase 1 trials. And we have seen with phase 1 trials of various medications, things can go badly. There was a notable trial in France some years ago where most of the participants ended up passing away in a phase 1 trial. These are not without risks. A patient should only agree to the proposed treatment or procedure if he or she has been provided with sufficient information, including the benefits, associated risks, and alternative management options, so they are able to make an appropriate decision about their own healthcare. How do you give informed consent on the basis of receiving sufficient information when there is no information? And yet people did this. People did this, and we are benefiting from it. We're very lucky indeed. So we have vaccines that are registered in Australia, that have provisional registration, much as we all got a provisional driver's licence before we got our open driver's licence. We didn't go through the emergency use protocols that they did in the United States and elsewhere. In Australia, we went through the full regulatory process that we would for any other medication. And these vaccines have passed muster and are now in our fridges and in our arms. And we've benefited from that, from that research process that has gone through that some people have put themselves at risk for. What about children? So the UK, many countries around the world, now Australia as well, has approved Pfizer for 12 to 15-year-olds. Okay, 12 to 15-year-olds, high school students, they're beginning to make their own decisions. In medicine, we talk about Gillick competence as a standard in law whereby a mature minor can make decisions for their own healthcare. That's okay, you don't have to be 18 to consent to treatment. But it gets a bit different when we are giving consent for our children to be vaccinated. 12 to 15-year-olds are one thing. We're talking about 5 to 11-year-olds, perhaps from early next year here in Australia. It's a bit harder for a 5-year-old to make an informed decision about their healthcare. I'm the parent of 2 children younger than 5. They can't decide what shorts they want to wear. I'm not sure they are going to be able to make an informed decision about what vaccine to give them. And yet, that's probably going to be a choice that my wife and I have to make going forward. Do we risk giving our children a vaccine which might lead to myocarditis or might lead to some other problem that we've encountered? Or do we expose them to the risk of developing COVID-19, knowing that they might get long COVID? And this isn't, I'm not special in this regard, none of us are. This is a decision that we all need to make, both for ourselves and for our loved ones, young and old, who may not be able to make their own decisions. And who of us can truly say that they're informed about all the pros and cons going ahead? I don't have a crystal ball. I work in public health and I have spent just about every day for the last 18 months dealing with COVID. I would say living and breathing COVID, but thankfully I haven't been breathing COVID. I know more about COVID-19 than many, but I still don't know a lot, and I still don't know that I'm truly comfortable in getting my almost 3-year-old vaccinated when it becomes allowed. But I'm also scared of long COVID. So we're talking about a voluntary decision with a gun to our heads. But let's just take a step back. We're talking about whether or not we want to be vaccinated, about whether or not I want my children to be vaccinated or you want your loved ones to be vaccinated. How privileged are we to have that choice? Here's a whole bunch of countries, rich and poor, developed and undeveloped, and what percentage of their populations have been vaccinated. There's a big red arrow next to Australia because it's a bit hard to see, and I apologise for that. And these figures are a little old, and that says that we're at about 77% double dose vaccinated across the country. Oh, sorry, that was 77% single dose and about 70% double dose. So a little bit old, this graph. But let's look down the bottom. The table's rounded out by Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Egypt, South Africa, Bangladesh. Countries that, unfortunately, are no strangers to being at the bottom of lists of resources. So we're talking about whether or not we want to get a vaccine that some people don't get to choose whether they're going to have or not. We have a strong government in Australia, a government who may have its faults, but a government that has provided testing and vaccines to the population free of charge. Many don't have that luxury. So when it comes to distribution, who gets what? Who decides that? Well, money, I guess, is the simple answer. We're a country of some 25 million, and we put in orders for over 100 million doses of vaccine. Now, okay, We suspected from the start that you'd need 2 doses of vaccine, so we'll say roughly 50 million, but that's if we're vaccinating the whole population. All right, we'll let that one slide. And now we're finding out we need to give a 3rd dose, so okay, maybe we do need 75 million doses. But we didn't in November last year, and yet we still put in orders for 100 million. The United States similarly put in orders for many, many times more than they would need themselves. Why? We had problems with AstraZeneca, as were well documented through the media earlier this year. And that was the one that we banked on here in Australia. We could manufacture in Australia, and we have been. But Australians stopped rolling up their sleeve to get AstraZeneca. And the Commonwealth Government was pillared for not having bought more doses of other vaccines. But we'd already bought far more than we had any right to expect, outbidding other countries that could not afford to. We live in a country that has a health system that provides universal health care. We may not always get it as quickly as we want, but if you're in trouble and you turn up to the emergency department, you will be seen and you will be given life-saving treatment, and we'll sort out the money later. And there aren't too many countries in the world that do that. So we've bought up a lot of vaccine. And we've decided in Australia that we don't want to get AstraZeneca. The people have spoken. People wanted to wait for Pfizer. We're now awash with Pfizer and Moderna, and we're probably going to get Novavax next year. So what happens to all this AstraZeneca? So CSL in Melbourne developed the capacity to produce 1 million doses a week of AstraZeneca vaccine. 1 million doses a week. You know how many doses of AstraZeneca are currently being administered in Australia per week? It's a lot less than 1 million. So what are we doing with that? Is it right for us to, our politicians to stand up and say we're very generously going to donate those doses to those less fortunate than us? Doses that the Australian public didn't want? Is it right for us to cease manufacture of those vaccines? Vaccines that countries in the Pacific can't manufacture themselves? People that have no other option for vaccine? And let's put those risks in perspective. Yes, AstraZeneca is associated with this weird clotting thing, this TTS, this thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, where your platelets, which normally form clots, go down, so you can't clot, and your body clots anyway. I'm glad I'm not a haematologist. That risk, though, is more in younger people and less in older people. It is thought to be around 1 in 50,000. So for those of us that have been lucky to go to a heaving Lang Park for a State of Origin match when 50,000 Queenslanders are baying for the blood of a New South Welshman, if you imagine that seething mass of humanity, one person in that crowd might develop a syndrome that we can treat. And because of that, millions of Australians said, no way, man, I'm not getting that vaccine. I'm going to wait for that other one, that better one that they're using in the States. So it speaks of our privilege, I think. So should we be ceasing manufacture because we don't want it, when we could be sharing it with our friends in the Pacific, in Asia, in Africa? Or should we be putting our money where our mouth is and saying, well, in Australia, Australians want Pfizer, and we've bought Pfizer vaccine for us, so we're going to buy Pfizer vaccine to donate. Would that be the better answer? We will only give others what we would take ourselves. And how are we going to get there? Well, fortunately, we've got things like COVAX. So COVAX is a global vaccine alliance made up by the Centre of Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, UNICEF, the World Health Organization. So they're the ones that are going around, they'll take those extra vaccines and they'll make sure that it goes where it needs to go. Thank goodness. So we do have some mechanism to be at the front of the queue and have some buying power. When the big boys like the United States and Australia say, yeah, we'll have 100 million doses of that, at least COVAX can put their hands up for the other 6.8 billion people in the world. This is an esky. We do good things and the politicians make sure we know about it, so we re-elect them. But it's an esky. We can deliver vaccines, and we do deliver vaccines, and we do a lot of good work. And I don't mean to belittle that in any way, shape or form. So we can share vaccines, and we do, and we should. But that's an esky. And that's to transport it. And when it gets to somewhere like Haiti, here, it sits in an icebox, if you're lucky. Pfizer vaccine needs to be stored at -80 degrees Celsius. I don't know about you, but when I put things in my esky, they don't seem to stay very cold for very long. And I definitely don't think they're going to stay at -80 in the Pacific. So then, perhaps we shouldn't be sending Pfizer vaccine to the Pacific, because there's no infrastructure. So unless we're willing to fund a cold chain which can hold a vaccine at -80 degrees until the day before you want to use it, Pfizer's essentially useless in undeveloped places. So let's go back to that AstraZeneca that we're pumping out at 1 million doses a week down in Melbourne, that we're going to stop production of shortly. That lives in a fridge. You could even put it in an esky. Suddenly, the second choice vaccine seems like a pretty good choice in some parts of the world. And I've been talking about the Pacific, about Asia, about Africa. I used to be a flying doctor. This is Queensland. This is a shed in a town called Urandangi, which is about 250 k's southwest of Mount Isa, where I was based. We used to fly into Urandangi every Tuesday fortnight, and we'd run a clinic. Urandangi has a population of about 40, give or take, but the surrounding cattle stations have hundreds of people who would drive for hours to come in and see us. Gets a bit warm there too. And that shed would be powered by a generator that the publican would fire up a couple of hours before we got there, so that when the doctor came, because they want to look after the doctor, I felt a bit sheepish about that, they wanted to look after the doctor by having air conditioning in the consulting rooms, so that when people came, they could sit on the veranda outside and catch the breeze, and then come into a nice air-conditioned office where I spent my time. Somehow they didn't quite work out a way to keep the plane cool on the tarmac, and it was regularly over 50 degrees when we hopped back in that, but that's a different story. But we talk about the other. We're in Toowoomba. We're in other well-resourced places around Australia. And we have the capacity to store vaccines at -80 degrees in Toowoomba, and we do. Just as we do in Brisbane and up and down the coast. But our cousins living, I was going to say a few hundred, okay, a couple of thousand kilometres west of here, don't. And they are in our state, not just in our country. And so when we think about the resources of distribution, of vaccines or of anything else, those challenges are real in this wide brown land. And those decisions are made every day. So we're lucky that we've got Pfizer here, and we're lucky that we've been able to have the infrastructure and the great work and commitment of Darling Downs Health to provide those vaccines throughout southern Queensland. So that it doesn't matter if you live in Dalby or Kingaroy or Gundawindi, you can have Pfizer as well. And similarly, our colleagues in Southwest and Central West dealing with further far-flung places. They've made sure that people can get vaccines in a timely manner as well. But many places aren't so lucky. And this is all going to change. And change is, of course, the great constant. And we've been talking about how we've been privileged to have the opportunity to be vaccinated. And we know that people have been scared of the vaccines and scared of the risks. Why would I roll up my sleeve and get vaccinated with something that has a 1 in 50,000 chance of giving me a clot that could kill me when there's no COVID? Well, we've moved past that dichotomy of no COVID or bad vaccines. We've now got vaccines with known risks and borders coming down. Borders are coming down, families are reconnected, more babies will be threatened of being crushed between their mothers and grandmothers. And so the question will become between the vaccine and COVID. And so the risk, the 1 in 50,000 risks of TTS, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, versus the 1 in a few thousand likelihood of developing a clotting problem with COVID infection, of developing permanent loss of smell and taste, of developing long COVID and chronic fatigue-like symptoms, of dying. That's what we're faced with now. And so I say a prayer, thankful that I live in Toowoomba, that I live in a country with good government, that has provided me the opportunity to get tested for COVID more times than I care to remember, to be vaccinated against this disease, which might cause untold harm on me and my loved ones, as it has on so many other families around the world. But I temper that prayer by thinking that no one is safe until we're all safe. That it's only by all of us getting vaccinated that the risk of variants that will escape vaccines is lessened. And whilst there is favouritism and resources are not being adequately or ethically distributed, there is a risk that this is all for nothing. And we'll go back to borders being up because we have variants of this virus that the vaccines don't work against. So it is in all of our interests that the vaccines are justly distributed, because no one is safe until everyone is safe. Thanks for your time.